different topic, the next question, which I didn't introduce that clearly. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. Diarmuid Bradley, Institute of Bankers. Does the panel think that qualifications such as CFA are a help or a hindrance to investment professionals in their work?
An interesting question in a room like this and for an organisation like this. Very challenging. And I'll put it to you, Marco.
I have to admit I don't hold the CFA myself, and I've always been a little bit envious of those people who've had the discipline and blood, sweat and tears mentality to sit through it. In the bond world, the CFA is not as well widely spread as it is in the equity world, as you probably know. But anybody who have encountered with a CFA degree has been, struck me as extremely knowledgeable, and I think it's a very good degree to hold. So I would be in favour of education in general, as long as it's relevant for the Irish economy.
I suppose it's fair to say that this question is about not just the CFA. CFA is an example of qualifications, but the question is, are qualifications, including the CFA, a hindrance or a help to investment professionals in their work? Or would anybody maybe identify that that anything in our educational background might have actually helped to bring about some of the difficulties that we're now in? Brian. Oh, sorry, Kevin.
I am actually a CFA, so I understand the pain that some people would have gone through there in the recent exams, and it is an extremely rigorous process to get through it, and I compliment anybody who manages to do it. And equally so, I'd encourage people that don't do it or haven't done it to maybe certainly take it on as a legitimacy of a higher standard. But I think there is flaws in every educational system and every educational, I suppose, a promotion of a particular area of expertise within the CFA. There is gaps, and certainly those gaps have been very much exposed over the last number of years. Certainly, in the likes of treatment of VAR analysis within the CFA programme. VAR means really very little when you deal with black swan events like last year. So nothing is perfect, but this is certainly that programme is a long way to getting to where people need to be to gain, I suppose, and promote a centre of excellence. But I think Charlie may have disagreements on that.
Well, in terms of education is a good thing, absolutely is. And at the end of the day, you stop learning, you stop growing. And as I was talking to somebody beforehand, you hear plenty of people who will tell you how many years' experience they have. But then ask them, do you really have 20 years' experience, or do you have 1 year's experience 20 times? And certainly when we look at the way people have come into this current crisis, they were behaving according to the rules of the 1990s. So it failed, because they had the 1 year's experience many times over, or the 1 period experience. But education, absolutely important, is I would very much believe is that you need to know the theory. If you don't know the underlying theory, well, then you can't do the practice properly. So it's very important to understand the theory and to be able to apply it in practice. The one danger in terms of education, and this is particularly true of MBAs, more so in America, is that the education system to a degree has been compliant in the entire crisis in terms of people speaking out, in that business schools are ranked according to graduate placement. Okay? So if you want the graduate placement, you have to produce the skill set that businesses require. So what does Wall Street require? And it's exactly as you said, value at risk, etc., etc. So you get students who are taught according to the thinking of the day. Is education should be about challenging the underlying opinions, etc., etc. And I would also say, is a glaring omission from the CFA, as far as I'm concerned, is financial history. It isn't there. It should be there. I mean, as they say, is history the future is simply the history you haven't read. So there's nothing about this current crisis that hasn't happened before.
And there's a book of Charlie's quotes available at the end. Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a CFA myself, but I think any qualification that is as hard to get as it sounds is probably worth having. I'd agree with Charlie. I think education shouldn't just stop the day you get your qualification, and I think the advent of things like CPD across a lot of different qualifications are very important, that people continue to keep up to date. so that you can develop and you are up to speed with new thinking. I think that is hugely important.
And Ross, you're an economist.
Don't have a CFA though. I think I'd echo what a couple of analysts have said. I mean, it always amazes me people in work how they somehow study for the CFA going at the time we do. It's remarkable. I think in terms of anything that boosts, I like my numbers myself. Anything that boosts quantitative and analytical skills, I think, is a big help. So I can't see how there's any damage to be done whatsoever by doing the course. And I think if you look ahead to the future, we'll need to just extend whether it be the CFA or further education in general. I think it's absolutely vital for this economy. If we do have the numbers of graduates out there, if those graduates can further themselves even more, I think it can only help. So definitely be in favour.
Before I come back to you, Dermot, are there any other views around the room about this? Anybody like to challenge? We've got a little bit of motherhood and apple pie at the table on this one, I think, in the comments. Is there anybody going to be critical of our education facilities? To call them a hindrance rather than a help. We have a first.
Well, I would say it's a hindrance, and speaking Pierce Farrell, and speaking personally from personal experience of being the person to give the smart answer in secondary school. And indeed, there was an elderly gentleman living down the road from me who spent his life, to give an example from an earlier time, he spent his life as a shepherd, and he was punished in school because he could do the maths problems in his head faster than the teacher. So that's the kind of fella who would now be recruited by any trading or financial company, but he was punished. But in the current time, it is a case of what Mr. Fell was saying, that there's a lot of, here's what you have to parrot on the day, you'll get your 2-2 or your 45% mark, now you can wheel out. And it is a case, I think, that unless there's a lot of putting things in context and encouraging people to be adaptive thinkers rather than just parroters of, or re-parroters of the standing dogma. We won't call it dogma anymore, but we'll call it conventional thinking or something like that, or the conventional wisdom, that there isn't any real thing, well, hold on. Or even the phrase, think outside the box. So the first thing you have to say, well, what is the box? What's in it? Who's put the stuff in there, and why are you in there as well? So it gets down to philosophy, and you'll probably pick up on some of the training I've had in that, but it gets down to maybe encouraging a more philosophical turn of mind. But the trouble with that is you then begin to question your value of the financial world you're in.
And we'll stop considering it at that point. There's another one. David.
Ronan, I was just going to say, just from my own personal experience, and I've done the CFA, and I've also done an MBA as well, so I've kind of gone down both routes. One of the things I think in Ireland that maybe we're not particularly good at is, people will often go out and try and do a course of some kind, and when they kind of come back to the organisation that they've worked with, presumably, to sort of improve themselves, they've tried to improve themselves or improve the organisation. I think sometimes there's a culture where we don't really actually try and make use of that. And what I mean is that I work with people in other countries, and there sometimes seems to me to be a much greater sort of encouragement, or it's almost regarded as a requirement in some ways for people to try and engage in education. And I think sometimes here we don't do that. I think sometimes we maybe take the guy who goes out and does the course and say, great, that's fantastic, but you don't really seem to try and get the benefit of that bit of education. And maybe even sometimes, you run into this attitude where, this guy's come back from business school, he's telling us what to do. He doesn't really know how things work. We've always done things a particular way around here, and that seems to be that's always been the best way, and it's served us well. I just don't think sometimes we get the attitude right, and sometimes I think education is a fantastic thing, but sometimes I don't think you always get rewarded for it.
Okay, thank you, David.
Can I just make a point on that? Just one of the things I think it is important when people are doing qualifications that they are learning, and they're not just focusing on passing the